somewhere near Magnolia. I don't know. I don't know Burbank very well.
Yeah.
Oh,
we should.
rolling.
Okay, we should go. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for being here, Ocean.
Thank you for having me.
Is Ocean your first name?
It is. It's my birth name, Ocean Pleasant.
Oh, I love it. Is Pleasant your last name?
Yeah, it's my mom's maiden name.
Wow. Okay, what a cool name. That's amazing. Where are you from?
I was born in Houston, Texas.
Nice.
And kind of grew up all over. My mom was a conflict journalist until I was like 12, so I was sort of just following her around the world and then settled back down in Texas for middle school, which was a very like abrupt lifestyle change.
Yeah.
But so when people ask me that, I guess Texas, but I don't have like when I think of home, there's like a house and a place and a city. It's more of just kind of
Yeah.
a weird blur.
I get that. Yeah, I relate. We watched your TED Talk, and it's so
amazing.
interesting
Oh, God.
how you got started. Do you want to talk about that at all? Like how you worked? You don't need to, but.
It's so funny because now it feels like a completely different lifetime when that was going on. So when I was 17, I started a youth culture magazine that aimed to kind of bridge these really big social issues with the demographic that was best prepared to tackle them, but in a way that utilized pop culture. So we'd get like, Alicia Keys talking about, women's rights, or, Richard Branson talking about environmentalism, and really just like bringing like issues and people together who cared about them. And so that was like a big part of like 17 to kind of 19. I got the Teal Fellowship and grew that through those few years, and that was around the time I gave those TED Talks. It was just about like figuring out your vulnerabilities and your passions and reconnecting to how you can make a difference by just being completely where you are now. But I also distinctly remember like I love to be very, very prepared for things, but I'm also really bad at procrastinating. So I wrote both of those talks. I think like one was the night before and one was like a week before. So now I have like PTSD thinking about it because I'm like, I can't watch myself. It's so cringy.
Oh,
but I'm like,
you were off book though. How did you memorize it?
Yeah.
I memorized it. I don't know how. I was just like,
In one night? That was amazing. Wow.
but now thinking back, I'm like, oh my god, like I just don't want to even think about how bad that was. But it's cool that I forget that it's out there on the internet.
And it's inspirational, and I think it's how do you take that message that you were talking about, and how does it inspire you as a musician now and in your career now?
So that idea of like getting vulnerable and getting really honest about like where you are, I realized I had been treating music like this hobby that I would just do when I had time, but when you kind of treat something that way, you never actually have time for it. And it just felt like when I did music, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and when I wasn't doing music, it was like, what am I doing? And so I reached a point where it was like, okay, I have the opportunity to continue on this completely different trajectory, or I can take a huge risk and a huge leap and be like, you know what, if I'm being honest, like this is where I want to be in my life right now. And so that thing where I was like, oh, I'm talking about vulnerability, but I'm not being vulnerable with myself, like this is not where I see myself in 5 years. So I like in that whole like period of time, I was like 19, like living with a partner in New York City, running a company, raising VC money, doing all of this, and my guitar is in the case under the bed, and I'm like, what am I doing? So I like in the span of like 3 months just like left all of that behind and booked a one-way ticket to LA, and I've been here ever since.
Wow. That's incredible.
That also makes me panic thinking about that. I'm like, how did I do that?
And it might feel impossible looking back, but it's such an inspiration to watch that evolution of your life. And what I also think is really interesting is listening to the evolution of your music and just like hearing those tracks and how I'm so curious like how you've like made that evolution and that leap and come up to a sound like Party Trick, which is just so complex and interesting and cool and unique and fresh, and like how like what has that musical evolution been like amid all of like these life changes?
So the first song I ever released was called Love Letter to Myself, and I wrote it when I was 15 at summer camp because I was feeling like really excluded and just like weird like 15-year-old things at camp, I don't know. And And so my camp counselor would like sing us to sleep every night with a ukulele, and we were also had like a poetry class at camp. And so I wrote this self-love poem, and I read it to my counselor, and she's like, well, why don't you turn that into a song? And I'm like, well, that's ridiculous. I've never sang in my life. Like, that's okay, sure. So I tried it. I like went off in the forest by myself for a few hours. She showed me a few chords, and then I like ended up turning that poem into what became the first song I put out 2 years later. And so I think since that evolution of like something I wrote when I was 15 and then a song that I wrote when I was 22 is kind of like growing up and like the process of growing up. And you know, I love that first song that I made, but it's also like that was just like the awakening of like figuring out that I could sing and that I could write a song, and then what that looked like after that. And Party Trick was like, you know, years later, where I've kind of marinated in what I've figured out about myself, and I've figured out what sounds I like, and I've met people that are fun to work with who also feel the same about just sonically what we're attracted to. And so that's been, I think, the biggest difference is there isn't any other industry or craft where you'd be sounding or looking or seeming the same way like 5-6 years later. So that's kind of that story arc, was just growing up while also making music as like a little I guess like way to track like how old I am and what I'm going through and what my sound is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you talk more about your current sound? We have a quote from her Instagram?
Yeah.
A chunk of raw rose quartz on a warm summer morning.
That you used to describe Party Trick. I thought that was just
Oh my God.
beautiful.
Can you describe the sound of that song for people who haven't listened, and
Right.
also sort of your inspiration in general for where you are right now?
Right, so Party Trick was born out of the very classic will they won't they situation that went on for far too long. And it was, for me, the lyrics and the melody and the music all had kind of different inspirations, and I think that's why like when you put them all together, it kind of creates this kind of unique blend, because we kind of approached it from a bunch of different ways. And so like lyrically it was kind of a self-liberation from half-loves and maybe lovers, and just realizing like this situation could go on forever until I decide that it has to stop. And so that was the inspiration lyrically, but then the sound was like, if this isn't a sad song, like this is an awakening, this is a realization that there's so much more beyond this, and I just have to like seize this moment for what it is, recognize it for what it is. And so it was like this chunk of like rose quartz on a warm morning. It was just, to me, like this kind of like glistening entity that was like, okay, the day's about to start, and I recognize the beauty in that, and it's like, okay, I'm like letting go of like what happened last night, and it's just like, here we are.
I love
So
that.
That's amazing.
Do you have any icons that you look up to musically?
I grew up listening, of course, to like Joni Mitchell and Ben Harper, and more quirky like Randy Newman, like, you know, Temptations. So for me, it's like, if anything feels and sounds really honest, I'm usually like very inspired by it. So my range is very broad in terms of like physical inspiration. And then I think on a more like galaxy brain note, I think lately I've been realizing, I think I was super insecure for a long time about how sensitive I am, but then I realized that in this weird struggle to like desensitize myself, I wasn't creative anymore, because I was cutting myself off from the entire, you know, just like the atmospheric, like energy is so atmospheric, and I feel like like a lot of people, you know, you walk into a room and it's like these drive-by empathetic hits of like, what's that person feeling, what's that person feeling, and suddenly it's just like this like feedback loop download of way too much all the time, and simultaneously like living in a time where the powers that be are benefit the more you look away. And so I'm like, for me, my inspiration has just come from not looking away, like whether it's like my own feelings or what's going on around me or with my friends. It's like I'm not looking away, and that's hard and that's scary, and it's like, but that for me has been like, I think being able to articulate inspiration as not looking away.
I love that. I feel like you need to copyright that, first of all. But what advice would you give to the younger generation of musicians that are like you, who find themselves inundated with constant text messages and Instagram and this feeling of not being enough? I mean, it's really easy to look away.
Right.
What would you say to them?
I mean, if anyone has advice for me on that,
Fair
I
enough.
would love to hear it. I think we are so inundated with opinions and comparisons, and I compare myself to people every day without even realizing it. Like, it's just, you know, there's always like gonna be someone who can sing better or is a better instrumentalist or has more connections or whatever it is, and or their aesthetic is more cohesive, or their brand. Like, it's if you look for reasons why it won't work, you will always find them. And so for me, it's more, am I being honest in the way that I'm showing up with what I'm making, with where I'm performing, with the people I'm talking to? Because you, in your most honest state, there's no one else that can show up in that way. And so that maybe is like a roundabout answer, is maybe a little too broad, but I think even listening back to music that I made where I'm like, oh my gosh, like I wouldn't like release that now, like archives and Dropbox of just old songs and demos, but I'm like, but wow, like I felt that. Like that was really honest. And for that reason, it doesn't feel dated. And so I think creatively for new musicians, where everyone's like, how are we gonna create the next so-and-so, or the next this or that, or what sound is really popping off right now? It's like, you know, trends are real, but also like honesty doesn't go out of style ever.
Yeah, and I think if you look at certain artists who have blown up currently, like for example Billie Eilish, there's something really honest about the way that she creates music and what she sings about. And I was reading about her and her brother. They record little sounds that they hear throughout life, and when it inspires them, they throw it in the music.
Right.
And you know, she had Ocean Eyes, and then years later blew up. But instead of following sort of like a typical pop direction, I think she really stayed honest. And I think, you know, that's when someone really becomes iconic.
I think there takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing and to really follow that honesty instead of running after trends. And I think that's awesome. And to wrap up our interview today, we are so excited that you're performing at our secret show today.
We do.
I would love to hear if you have, I know that you're performing Party Trick and another song. If there's a story or something that you want to share for either of those songs, I know you shared a little bit about Party Trick, a little bit behind the scenes for one of them. We'd love to hear it.
Right. So, yeah, Party Trick is about reclaiming the time you spent on someone who didn't want you back. And the other song is, I made it with the same producer, so sonically it kind of feels like a close cousin to Party Trick, which is why I want to play them together. But it's called Hit and Run. It's going to come out pretty soon. And it's kind of almost a precursor to Party Trick, in the sense that depending on your own personal experience, like this story could pick up before or after Party Trick, and it's about like recognizing when you have something very real with someone, but it's not the time to go that deep with them. It's not the time to have that closeness, and so as a result, there's still just a lot of confusion. But ultimately, it's like, okay, like if this isn't what you're choosing, then like that's okay. And so it's kind of a close cousin or sister to Party Trick in that way. And yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking your time to articulate such like beautiful thoughts about the industry, and we're so excited to have you with us as part of our Kingdom of Pavement playground. That's what we're calling it. And we're so excited to hear your new song.
Thank you so much for having me. So
Yay!
excited to be here.
Amazing. You're awesome, and also your outfit is incredible.
I'm, like I said, bring the Moo Moo back. 2020 is my love it.